Hi, I'm Danielle Peterson, and today for CPD on Demand we will be talking to Natalie Reinecker, Senior Associate at MDA Consulting, and Ewan Massey, Director of MDA Attorneys. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll be discussing public-private partnerships and design-build-operate contracts. So maybe we can start off by discussing the current procurement challenges faced by South Africa's construction industry.
Well, I think there are quite a few. The problem that we have in terms of procurement in South Africa is that we adopt what we call a traditional form of procurement, where a local municipality or a public authority will identify a need. That will then go into a feasibility study, which will then go into construction, and then there'll be a construction phase. And how that works from a budgeting perspective is that monies have to be allocated through either, or firstly at national budget level, and then more locally at municipal budget level, and they allocate it on a per year basis and as and when needs arise. And we have various competing needs at the moment. So what's happening is that we are sort of going along as these problems arise and tackling the worst problems first, and the problems are growing and growing and growing, and there seems to be a shortfall in the funding. So large infrastructure projects and local infrastructure projects, which are necessary and needed, are not being executed. And where they are executed, the budget constraints mean that the budget is allocated on a per year basis, which results in budget shortfalls for that year, which prolongs construction. And we have numerous anecdotal examples of local wastewater treatment plants and other municipal plants which are supposed to be executed in a matter of 1 or 2 years, which are taking 6 or 7 years to complete. And you know, the population is growing, we need the services, and there are problems from that perspective. I think over and above that, both the engineering consultants and the other consultants that are employed, as well as the contractors that are employed, are done so on a lowest cost basis. So tenders are submitted, and during feasibility and the design phase, the bare minimum is done because they're done on a lowest cost basis, which results in numerous changes arising during the execution phase. And construction projects are budgeted, the budgets are overshot, they go beyond the expected duration, and that results in all these projects in and of themselves being pushed out, never mind the budget constraints. So I think there is a problem with that.
So essentially our biggest problem is a finance gap.
Yeah, one of the problems. I mean, we have several problems, but I think from today's conversation, I think the biggest problem we have is how these are financed. And if we look at international arrangements in other countries, you know, they've made a move to different funding models, which we haven't really. We have in part, which Natalie will talk about a bit later. But you know, our model is still very traditional. We get our funding from the central government, and that has its problems. You know, and things like hospitals, prisons, wastewater treatment plants. These are all utilities that we need as a population, and if they're not executed on time, if they continue to build and build and build in terms of what we require, then we're just never going to get to a space where we are equaling our infrastructure demand with what our population requires.
So one of the alternative funding options then is public-private partnerships, or PPPs. So what are the opportunities then in South Africa given this challenge we're facing?
Well, if you look at the definition of what a public-private partnership is, it is essentially a partnership between a government institution, be it on a national level or a municipal level. And what it does is it partners a private party with a public institution to bring in skills and bring in funding to develop and deliver a project, which will then ultimately deliver the services that are required.
So how do PPPs fit within the current legislative framework?
So currently governmental institutions or state institutions are governed by a number of pieces of legislation that basically govern how they spend their money. So the PPP has actually been recognized by National Treasury as being a form of a way forward for funding of projects and delivering of projects. So they've actually developed quite specific regulations that deal with how a PPP is established and how it's funded and how it's then executed. At the moment, on a provincial level, it's your Public Finance Management Act. It has a Regulation 16, which deals specifically with PPPs. And then also on your municipal level, you have your Municipal Finance Management Act, which has its own regulations. So you can basically split it up between your national and provincial, and then your municipal. Quite interesting, because I think since about 2000 we've been developing not only the legislation around bringing in or making PPPs more available to parties within the construction and service delivery space, and they're actually quite advanced in terms of what's out there in the regulations, in the acts, how we interpret the acts and how we implement these projects.
And so what are some of the advantages and disadvantages to consider if you're looking at entering into a PPP?
Well, I think from an advantage perspective, if we look at how a PPP is structured, you basically have a project company which is separate and distinct from its shareholders, your shareholders being the people that are actually going to execute the project. And one of the advantages is that the assets that form part of the project are not only just built and then handed over back to the municipality to then manage and maintain, because we know that maintenance is a bit of an issue with some of the state assets. And what happens is over the duration of the contract, which can be as long as 20 or 30 years, they're actually providing a maintenance service to maintain those assets, being the project company itself. It's called a special purpose vehicle that's set up. So that for me is a definite advantage, is the maintenance, which is consistent and regular, and by professionally skilled people who are able to maintain those assets to provide the output.
Yeah. Perhaps I could just come in there as well. The traditional model that I was talking about earlier, a typical construction contract, you have a construction period, and then you have something called a defects notification period, which is typically a year. So what happens is with a piece of infrastructure, the contractor will build it, and then there'll be a handover phase, which typically includes some training and operation and maintenance manuals and a couple of other things. And then there's a year warranty period where they come back and fix certain defects. At the end of that, there's nothing. There's no warranty for the state institution. There's nobody to make sure that it's being operated correctly, to make sure that the people that were trained originally continue to maintain that plant, that further training is done, as certain developments are made in that piece of infrastructure. And we have, I think it's a recognized problem. We have a massive problem at the moment with maintenance of our infrastructure. So that overcomes that particular problem, a PPP. One of the disadvantages, and it's not really a disadvantage of the actual structure of it, but it's a disadvantage which appears here in South Africa, is that at the moment we've got very limited capacity for executing PPP. So when I talk about that, I'm talking about in the sort of legal framework and within Treasury. They've got a special task team within Treasury which executes on PPPs, and they review them and they decide whether they go ahead and all those kinds of things. And within Treasury there's limited capacity. So what we've seen is that since the inception of PPPs in South Africa in the late 1990s to date, there have only been approximately 30 to 40 PPPs executed, and they're typically executed on a very large scale to maximize that limited capacity. So we haven't seen them executed at a municipal scale. The ones which have been executed are running very well. So there's some very good PPPs out there.
So, with that in mind, how can we better use PPPs to solve this challenge that we face in terms of procurement and maintenance, that kind of thing?
Yeah, well, one of the advantages that we haven't really spoken about is that from a funding perspective, the private party involved in the PPP offers the financing, and they use their balance sheet to raise the financing. And the typical model will be that they provide the large majority of the upfront financing to execute the work, and then they recoup that financing over the 20 or 30 year lifespan of the concession contract which they get as a result of the PPP arrangement. What that does is that it allows the state institutions to have the infrastructure built when they need it, and then have it maintained at a fairly minimal cost over a long duration. So it's a lot more affordable, I think, over a long period of time. You take something like a hospital, which we don't have any PPP hospitals in South Africa, but in the UK, they build a large majority of their hospitals on a PPP basis, and the arrangement typically with the NHS is that they then procure those hospitals on a per bed, per night basis. So depending on how the occupancy of that hospital is run, depends on how much money they have to pay. So if they fill the hospital up, then they pay for it. If they don't fill the hospital up, then they don't pay for it. So I think it's a very well-structured model from a governmental perspective, because it allows them to procure things as they need them and not build a hospital which isn't really needed and not really used. And we do have some examples of hospitals. That Nelson Mandela Children's Hospital, for example, is sitting empty at the moment. It's built, it's finished, and it's sitting empty.
And I think also what it does is it allows the actual governmental institutions the opportunity to focus their efforts on actual outputs of the delivery, as opposed to providing the service delivery themselves. They can form a lot more of a focused effort without having to worry about the service delivery aspect of it. I mean, there are a couple of PPP hospitals.
Yeah, okay.
There are, yeah. They're
So-
in the Eastern Cape, I think, in the Western Cape.
Okay. Then the other thing which is an advantage to the state is that another recognised problem that we have is a lack of skills within both provincial and municipal structures. And I mean, we've heard it all before, that the clerk of works or the town engineer that each town used to have doesn't exist anymore. If there's a water treatment facility built in a small rural town, and that's run by a private company, that problem's overcome quite easily. So
Yeah, and I think those private companies, because they earn their income, or they're part of the shareholding structure of the special purpose vehicle, they are quite motivated to make it work well and produce the goods or produce the services, because that's how they make their profits.
Yes.
So it's almost a win-win situation.
Because obviously it's very beneficial to the public entity, because you're taking that load off of them. But what are some of the motivating factors for the private sector to get involved?
I think from the private sector, for them, it's a long-term revenue stream. So they enter into a contract where they base it on a business case, where they will obviously recoup a steady profit over a long period of time. And often you see construction companies get into these types of arrangements, and they do that because it gives them a guaranteed revenue over a long period of time with a virtually, not quite guaranteed, but a fairly set profit margin. Which is very different to their typical work, where they tender for a particular contract and take the risk that they're going to make a profit. And we only need to look at what's happening at the moment. Construction companies, the risk is quite high, and a lot of companies are not making profits and are in fact making significant losses. So it's a way of sort of procuring long-term work at a steady profit margin for them.
Yeah, and I think just to bring in an element that we haven't discussed already, in terms of one of the requirements of a PPP project, is that we bring in a BEE element. So your SMMEs, what they will do is they will also become shareholders in this project company, which is often run by a more experienced main shareholder, or we can call him that. And what happens is they, by getting involved in this project long term, essential skills get transferred to them. So it's very beneficial for the smaller guys, the smaller BEE guys, to be involved in this kind of project.
Yeah, also I'd like to add to that as well, and I mean it's something that I've raised a lot in things that I say, is that the construction company is a massive employer in this country, and what we are doing at the moment is we are seeking to place targets on community participation, where somebody is employed for a year-long contract and then they're not employed again. On these long-term projects, people are able to be employed through the construction into the maintenance, and it's long-term employment for 20, 30 years, and not for a year or 6 months. So I think it's a magnificent opportunity for that.
Be a nice buy-in from the local communities, I think.
So it sounds like, Triple P's kind of address a lot of what government is motivating for at the moment, in terms of community participation, BEE involvement, SMME growth. Is there a reason that the government then isn't pushing more for PPPs and making it easier to get them up and running?
Well, I think that since, as I mentioned previously, since the 2000s, they've spent a lot of time and a lot of effort in preparing world-class or international standard regulations and rules that go around the PPPs. And I think now that those are in place, and they've actually set up a special, it's called the GTAC, which is a special arm of National Treasury, which is focused specifically on PPPs and educating the governmental institutions of the benefits thereof. I think we'll start seeing it a lot more. I think people didn't know what they were. They were confused by them. They were scared by them. What are they? How can they benefit us? And I think through the training and through the implementation of some of them, we've actually seen more of a growth in the projects actually moving from the inception phase through to the feasibility and procurement phases. So it's only a matter of time, I think, before. And I also think one of the barriers to entry is that it requires, generally from a municipal level, someone to actually come up with the concept. So the municipality will have to say, well, we have this idea, we have this piece of land, and we have this requirement, and we need to then go and register that with the PPP office arm of the National Treasury. And I think, that's maybe also a little bit of a barrier.
And contractors and entrepreneurs are also concerned about putting forward ideas, because if you put forward an idea and you say, well, this particular town requires this piece of infrastructure, you put forward an idea and then it goes out on tender. So you may do all the work in terms of feasibility and business case scenarios. You put forward the idea and it goes to somebody else. So people are concerned about that, I think.
So are there risks involved with entering into a PPP?
Yes, there are risks. Obviously, the main risk, one of the risks being that when it's funded by a bank, for example, is that the necessary returns might not be made on the outputs of the project, which will leave a gap in the funding. There is the risk that the project company itself falls into some kind of financial distress, and the financial institution will then step into the function and take over the asset, as to speak. And we know financial institutions aren't geared to run major infrastructure projects, so that's one of the risks, I think. And
well, they're your typical risks as well. So there's sort of community risks and governmental risks, and I think the GFIP, the Gauteng Freeway Improvement Program, is an example. There are many PPPs that have done well. The community reaction to being told wasn't a good one, and that's not working.
Yeah, I think that specific Gauteng, the improvement project, wasn't structured to be a PPP. And I think if it had been, perhaps by getting the buy-in during the feasibility study of the community, would have actually either shown whether it would fail or not. And it's quite, the PPPs are quite strict in terms of when there's certain phases that they have to go through. It has to be affordable. That's the first phase. Once we found that it's affordable for that institution, it then jumps to the next phase, which is it value for money? And then if it's value for money, can we pass significant risk onto the contractor? So I think by going through these phases, even though it's there's quite a big burden, to jump through these hoops to get to the final approval of Treasury, what it does is it creates a project that is probably more strong than it would be, because they've done the necessary investigations, they've actually had the conversations, they've seen the revenue streams, they've done their investigations in the community into the buy-in, into where they're going to get their money from, and I just think it's a fantastic way of delivering infrastructure projects.
Yeah. Just to add to that, when you have a project which requires so much upfront work, it's very different to what I called earlier the traditional procurement structures, where by the time the contract's signed with a PPP arrangement, everybody knows the risk. Everybody's done the geotechnical investigations, everybody's engaged with the local communities, and those contracts generally go a lot smoother.
But is that then also a challenge that maybe in the current method the municipalities and public entities aren't used to doing that work up front?
Yeah, I think if you look at, if listeners want to go and have a look at how the process works within the GTAC, which is the advisory arm of the government, it actually sets out quite specifically the steps that need to be taken, and they actually hold your hand through those processes. I think from a municipal perspective, what has to happen is a project officer needs to get appointed, and there's actually specifications of the qualifications that a project officer needs to hold. And I think there's perhaps a lack of people within the municipalities who have that skill to be able to develop a project and be registered as a project officer. Yeah, so having the fact that the municipality has to be the champion and the one who has to actually put it forward, I think maybe once they realise that there is this arm of the Treasury that can guide them in every step of the way, they'll be a little bit more willing to put forward ideas and say this is what we need, because they will actually have their hands held throughout the entire process.
So maybe you can tell us a bit more about that and where people can go to find out more and get the resources that they need.
So As I've said before, they've set up the National Treasury has set up a specialist arm called the GTAC, which is the General Transactional Advisory Council, which has set up an amazing website. If you want to go and have a look, it's www.gtac.org.za. And what they've got in there, they've got basically workbooks. So it's like studying. It's a textbook on how these things happen, what the legislation is, how a municipality would go with an idea to the GTAC and say, help me with this. This is what I need. And then the project officer would obviously get appointed, and then a transaction advisor would get appointed, and they would hold their hands throughout throughout the process. For contractors, as Ewan said earlier, if they have an idea, it's a little bit difficult. You obviously take the idea to your municipality, and the municipality will then have to have the skills or the inclination to take it up a level through to the GTAC to ask to have it registered as a project. And then, as Ewan said, they risk the losing the project because it has to go out on open tender.
But there is an opportunity then for the private sector to come up with ideas and approach.
Absolutely, there is. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, and you mentioned the Gauteng Freeway Improvement Project as something that kind of didn't work that well, but can you maybe give us some examples of PPPs that did work and that, are good success case studies?
Gautrain.
Yeah, Gautrain.
I've been on that one, so we all know that.
The N3 between Harrismith and Sadara is a PPP, which is working well. A number of the toll roads, national toll roads, are working very well.
And in fact, the sandparks, from a tourism perspective, the sandparks have a number of registered PPPs, like tented camps, safari camps, so that for tourism, and that's aimed at the smaller SMME type of contractors who then can get involved in the tourism sector, and they're also working very well.
And is there an opportunity to learn from these for the people who maybe want to approach or get involved in a PPP?
There isn't much material that's published on them. Again, I think the website that Natalie referred to will give some guidance, but it's not going to give detailed case studies as to how well they're operating. We understand why they're operating well because we've been involved in some, not all of those projects, but we've been involved in some of them. So we've seen the other side of it, either mostly from the private sector, and sometimes from the public sector as well.
Okay, and now if we move slightly away from PPPs, we come to design, build, operate contracts, which I think are a type of PPP. So maybe you can tell us how those fit in and what exactly is a design, build, operate contract.
Yeah. I think they're similar to PPP contracts. They're not exactly the same. So when we talk about PPP contracts, we're talking about a very specific structure where there are various layers of contracts. There's a concession contract between the state and the special purpose vehicle that's set up, and then there are various construction contracts below that and operation and maintenance contracts as well. So there's a tree of contracts, if you like. With a design, build, operate contract, it's a far simpler structure. It's one contract where you have one employer and one contractor, and that contractor is responsible for the design of the works, the construction of the works, and the operation of the works. And where it differs from a PPP is that it is a little bit more flexible in that you can have a transfer at the end of the duration of the operations period, so that the works that are being constructed can be transferred to the employer, or you could have an arrangement where at the end of that period the contractor packs up the works, dismantles the works, and takes them away. The other difference is that the design, build, operate contract can also be used in the private sector, and it's not confined to the public sector. So you could have a mine, for example, which requires a coal crushing and washing plant, and that could be set up as a mobile unit on that particular mine. It's operated for a period of time. At the end of that period of time, it's then removed and the contractor sets it up somewhere else.
I think another major difference as well, if I can jump in, is that the employer funds the project. So during the design build phase of a design build and operate, he gets his monthly payment certificates. They get paid to him, and then at the end of the design build phase, he takes ownership of what the contractor has built, and then the operations phase starts. So there's no takeover. In a normal design and build contract, the employer would take over the works at the end of the contract. Now we have a design build phase with no takeover. however, ownership will transfer in the asset that has been built, and then the contractor will then operate it almost like as a separate operations portion of the contract. So it's quite distinct in terms of how it splits it up into design, build and operate.
But it would then address some of those challenges we have in terms of maintenance, skills problems and so on.
It has exactly the same benefits from that perspective as PPP contracts. Typically they're also long-term contracts. So the standard forms that we have for design, build, operate contracts usually recommend 20 years. So as an operations phase. So there's a construction phase before that design and build phase, and then there's an operations phase of 20 years. A lot of the contracts we've drafted for employers in the private sector, they've requested that period be shortened. So in our experience, Natalie and I have worked on a number of contracts where our clients have said to us, no, we want it sort of closer to 10, 7 years. So I think that the pay, the amount that's paid by the employer is a lot more compressed. So there's a bigger capital outlay, as Natalie was saying.
So does that then also cause problems in terms of the funding issue we discussed right at the beginning?
It's a different, in the private sector it's slightly different, because what we're talking about usually is a mining house, and they have a balance sheet where they can raise the finance if they like. Sometimes they decide to change the contract so that some of the financing, upfront financing, is covered by the employer and some of it is covered by the contractor. And then there's a structured repayment mechanism during the operations phase. So it's a slightly different basket of risks in the private sector. But there's nothing to prevent the design, build, operate arrangement being transferred into a PPP space. It would need some amendment. But for smaller, particularly municipal arrangements, I believe that the design, build, operate model could be incorporated into a PPP space there. It's for the larger projects, I don't think it's suitable, but definitely for smaller municipal projects it would work.
And I think just jumping in there, talking about some of the challenges the municipality might face, is that the legislation around PPPs actually prescribes the contract that needs to be used, and there's quite a specific requirement that if any of those, the terms of that contract that has been prescribed by the legislation needs to be changed, there's a whole process that they need to go through. So here we have, like Ewan was saying, a more simpler structure for design, build and operate, which could work within municipal. Then we've got this massive 300-page contract, that this municipality will have to sign, which is perhaps also a bit of a barrier. It's quite a hectic contract that's prescribed.
So maybe you can then elaborate a bit more on where design, build, operate contracts fall into the current framework and how they are allowed for.
In the current framework, they're not allowed for. So they're not being used in the public-private partnership space at all. Where we are using them is in the private space. And there have been a number of contracts which we've drafted over the last 5-6 years in the private space. And those projects are private sector water treatment plants, private sector mining projects, typically crushing plants and washing plants. And that's where we see the majority of the contracts which we've drafted fall into the design, build, operate space. From my perspective, I think that where PPPs need to be focused is at a lower level. So at the moment they're seen at a national level or provincial level, and we're not seeing them at a municipal level, and that's where we need to see them implemented. And there we're talking a much smaller contract size. But there are companies out there that are geared to do that kind of work. Operations companies and construction companies.
And I think through the GTEC and through this learning process, I think we're going to be seeing it a lot more. If you look at, if you follow the GTEC website, they actually tell you some of the projects that are in the inception phase, and you'll see some of them are at a municipal level. So we're feeling positive that we're moving in the right direction. We have all the processes and policies in place. There's absolutely no reason why we shouldn't be doing this successfully on a larger scale.
Yeah, there are some that are involved, municipal PPPs in KwaZulu-Natal that are on that list, and they're water treatment plants.
One or two years.
Okay. Then if we look at design, build, operate contracts, what are the advantages and disadvantages for the private sector, but then also for the public sector to consider if they were to move into that space?
So I think the advantages, as we've said already, from a maintenance perspective, are similar. So the skill set of the the contracting organisation is carried through from the design through to the construction through to the operations and maintenance phase. The other advantages from a private sector perspective is that there's a level of flexibility in terms of how it can be funded, and there are some slight differences between the various standard forms, but they have some innovative ideas with regards to things like asset replacement and maintenance retention and things like that. So the employer can dictate to the other contracting party when certain key assets must be replaced, how regularly maintenance must be completed, and there are penalties associated with the contractor not doing that, which are in those standard form contracts. So that those are fairly innovative when you look at them compared to the PPP contract, for example. But those could also be carried across, as we were talking about now, they could be carried across to the municipal PPP space if people have the appetite to do it.
And so what are some of the advantages if we look at the fact that with these kinds of contracts they will be operating the plant that they've designed and built? How does that improve the design and the build process?
What happens is that when you are responsible for designing it, building it and operating it, you take into account during the design phase the workability of the design and the total cost of ownership of the design. So you're typically looking, if you're going to be operating a plant for 20 years, you're looking at the value for money design. Very often in the traditional procurement model, you have somebody who designs the plant who's never run a plant before, and they've never constructed a plant before. They've designed lots of plants, but they've actually never been involved in the construction and operation of the plant. So they don't see all of the different ways in which you can improve on that design to make it more workable, more maintenance friendly, to have a lower total cost of ownership. And although some of the traditional procurement models allow for things like value engineering, that aren't always employed on contracts. So by giving that responsibility to the designer, the builder and the operator, hopefully you're going to get a design which is workable and is fit for purpose over the duration of the operations phase.
And then that would also, similar to PPPs, go look into long-term employment opportunities.
Correct.
And that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Okay. And so there are some standard form contract options available. Can we maybe discuss some of those?
Yeah. So the FIDIC form has what they call the Design, Build, Operate contract, and it's referred to as the Gold Book, and that's been around since 2008, 2009, and then in 2017, last year, 2017, the NEC brought out the NEC 4 conditions of contract, and included in that suite is a Design, Build, Operate contract.
Yeah, I think just to mention that the FIDIC suite of contracts is one of the suites of contract that is prescribed for use by the CRDB. Now the CRDB then governs how public procurement must happen, and it's quite interesting that the FIDIC Gold Book is then prescribed as a contract form which can be used by the government. However, I've never heard of the government actually even using one before. Never seen it.
And the NEC 4 hasn't been prescribed yet, but it should be, because currently the NEC 3 is prescribed. So we would expect that in the near future that will change within the CIDB.
And how would you go about selecting which contract is the most appropriate?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
So often it depends on the client. So the two standard forms offer something completely different. The NEC 4 or the NEC suite in total is something which is more collaborative and probably geared towards something closer to a partnering type contract, alliancing type contract, and leaves a lot up to the parties to sort out between themselves, and it isn't really written in the contract. Whereas the FIDIC conditions of contract are quite prescriptive and tell you exactly what you have to do. So that's better for people who aren't used to partnering and alliancing. And where we are at the moment in the South African context is that I think we're more towards the traditional style of contract, where people like to have their rights and obligations defined in paper in front of them and not left to determine as and when you go through the contract and sort out between yourselves, because that often breaks down. So I think what we've seen, and the two contracts have been around for different periods of time, so it is definitely slanted because the Gold Book has been around a lot longer. But all of the contracts which we've drafted in the design, build, operate space have been based on that particular contract.
And can you design your own contract?
You could, yeah, you could draft your own, what we refer to as a bespoke contract. And we have seen a few of those. The PPP contracts are bespoke contracts.
Yeah. I think there's obviously risks involved in that you're going to spend a lot of money up front. With a standard form, you can actually go to a bookstore and you can buy it, and you know that every contractor that tenders on your project will have that same book with those same standard terms and conditions. When it comes to a bespoke contract, it's normally drafted by an attorney who's addressing risks that the employer sees as being his major risks. And so you have to be quite careful when you're tendering on a project with a bespoke contract, because it's normally quite favourable to the employer.
Also the other advantage, and Natalie touched on it, is that a lot of those clauses have been to courts before, and they've decided how they should be applied. So we've got guidance on whether the contract is good or not. Whereas if you have a bespoke contract, it's never been to a court before, and you don't know which way it's going to go. So.
But with the standard contracts, obviously you would change and amend them to suit the specific requirements?
Well, yeah, you would. Let's talk about the FIDIC suite. Has something called particular conditions, and at the back of the contract there's even guidance notes on how to change it from a lump sum to a remeasurable, that kind of thing, if you're talking the yellow book. And also if things like the arbitration clause or the dispute resolution clause might not be suitable for South African contractors. I've had a couple of instances where the FIDIC Red Book was used, which is a construction works where it's been designed by the employer, and it came to the dispute resolution phase, and it was an international ICC arbitration, and it was for a small hole digging type of contract, and the contractor, because he was just claiming about money, he hadn't been paid, he didn't have the funds to then go and institute action in the ICC because he didn't have the money to do so. So it's quite important when we look at a standard form contract, particularly an international standard form, is to make sure that it fits within the context of South African law and what our clients can and can't do.
Yeah, one of the areas which we've picked up on is that in the FIDIC Gold Book, at least, there's a very difficult process to follow should you want to extract yourself from the contract. So if the works aren't performing in accordance with the design, then there's a process to be followed where you're supposed to try and sort out who's responsible. Is it the employer who's providing material that wasn't in line with the specifications, or is it the contractor who hasn't designed the plant properly? And there's a process that's followed, and if it's found out to be one of the other parties, then there's another process which can be followed. And anyway, it's a very long and arduous process, and when you get into a long-term contract and you want to extract yourself relatively quickly from that, it's very difficult. So we've seen that in our space, that a lot of our employers choose to try and introduce different processes there to ensure that if a party is at fault, there's a different process to be followed, which is a little bit quicker and a little bit more certain as to who's responsible.
Yeah, I think another common amendment in the DBO contracts is, as Ewan was saying earlier, is that sometimes the employer doesn't want to fund the whole project. So then we'd amend some of the clauses that will then say that where there's a small upfront payment to the contractor will fund the design build, and he will actually recoup the infrastructure costs through his outputs for the 5 or 6 years following the contract. And there we have to be quite careful about how we amend it, because then ownership might not transfer to the employer at the end of the design build. So when we're messing with these standard form contracts, you've got to be very, very, very careful, because you don't want to find yourself as a contractor or an employer in a hole that you can't get yourself out of. It's a dangerous exercise to do.
Yeah, we've had an experience where somebody who wasn't legally qualified introduced significant amendments into the FIDIC Gold Book, and with horrendous consequences.
But these contracts are long-term in nature. You mentioned people are looking to make them shorter, but if you're looking at a 15 to 20-year contract, what are the risks associated with entering into such a long-term agreement with someone?
There are lots of risks, as you can imagine. So things like inflation is a big risk. How do you deal with inflation? If something were to happen where we go through a period of hyperinflation or stagflation or something like that, how do we deal with it? How do we come up with a mechanism which is fair to both parties? Governmental risk. What happens if the government changes? We could have a change in government in the next 8 years, for example, and we have a completely different political party who's in power and has a completely different idea about public-private partnerships or design, build, operate contracts and how they should be run. So those are the kinds of things which are drafted into the standard form contracts and into the bespoke contracts that we look at. And then there are other risks like interruptions in the services operation period, interruptions during construction, how they're dealt with, and there are processes there which assign the risk to either the employer or the contracting party or to somebody else.
Yeah, also another one is perhaps non-recoup. They can't recoup the charges per unit that they've thought about. I mean, if you think about some of the municipalities that are on the ESCOM money, perhaps they won't be able to pay for the services that they're getting. I think that's also quite a big risk.
So clearly there are some risks involved, but there are also opportunities. So are DBO contracts the solutions to some of our problems in South Africa?
Definitely. I think the advantages that we've spoken about earlier are definitely something we need to look at within the South African environment. And as I said, design, build, operate contracts are beneficial to both the public and private sector. And I don't think they're being utilised sufficiently in both sectors. So there are lots of opportunities. We've seen some of the private sector clients use them to good effect. And we're seeing it also expand in other parts of Africa as well. We've been involved in some mining contracts in Botswana, which have employed the design, build, operate philosophy, and things have been good. So I think it's definitely something worth looking at.
And if we go back to the beginnings, one of the big challenges is finance. So what needs to be taken into account when you're looking at project finance?
So the project financing part of PPPs and DBOs is almost like a whole separate conversation, but it's worth mentioning because obviously the banks play a role, and there are separate agreements between the banks and the concessionaire in terms of PPPs or in terms of the contracting party in the design, build, operate contracts where there is financing. And they have their own financing agreements, but the banks don't want to take on risk, particularly risk in execution of the work and risk in the operation of the work. But in some instances, they just can't avoid it. A bit earlier, Natalie mentioned that there were step-in rights. So banks typically like to retain certain rights in the underlying contracts where they can step in if something goes wrong, normally in something like a liquidation. So if the party who had borrowed the funds was close to liquidation, the bank could step in and then ensure that that contract continued to run so that it protected its interest over the longer term duration of the contract and wasn't left wanting to find someone to pay the money, really, So
yeah, and I think as well, just to jump in there and say that on the PPP projects, because the asset is housed in the project house, that asset is generally used as security to the bank for the repayment of any loans that were made, which is very different from a design, build, operate type of arrangements between two private parties, I would imagine.
And there are different funding models also which are proposed by GTAC, and certain parts of your transaction can be funded in different ways. So there's more guidance there on the website.
There's also an involvement of the equity. There's also an equity portion. So it's not only just debt. There's a debt/equity for all of the finance fundies out there, whereby the stakeholders actually have a stake in the profits and shareholding of the special purpose vehicle.
And there are also some funding opportunities available.
Well, I think, when you look at the regulations and you look at the packs that have been produced by the GTAC and to guide, for example, a municipality in how to approach it or how to get involved in a PPP, you'll see that from the inception phase that there's actually some funding opportunities for the appointment, for example, of a transaction advisor. So the transaction advisor is the party that will have to hold the hand of the municipality and take them through the PPP process and steps. And it has been said that if that transaction advisor is not a good transaction advisor, the whole project can fail. So it's comforting to know that there is these financing opportunities available for the municipality to be able to afford a good, sound transaction advisor to take them forward.
Okay, so, as you mentioned earlier, there have been some successful PPPs in South Africa. So what do you think we can look forward to moving forward in this space? And, where should we be focusing?
I think that there will be a significant increase in triple Ps. Although the National Development Plan is sometimes referred to and sometimes not, in that plan there is a strong reference to triple Ps. So I believe that if we need to address the current economic climate, I think that one of the solutions which government will look to in the next few years is the implementation of PPPs. And Natalie was mentioning that there are a number of prospective PPPs at a municipal level already. So I believe we're going to see an expansion as to how they implemented, both at national level in terms of numbers and at municipal level in terms of reach. So at a municipal level we'll have a lot more triple Ps, but they'll be on a far smaller basis. Things like water treatment plants, local facilities that are required by the municipality. So I think the future looks positive for triple Ps in South Africa.
Yeah, I think I mirror that sentiment, you know, in looking at what we've established and the legislation that's been established and the guidance notes and having had discussions with various parties that are members of the GTAC and seen them speak. For me, I'm very, very positive about it, and I think we're definitely moving in the right way forward, and it's great, and I look forward to what's going to happen in the next couple of years.
Well, Natalie, Ewan, thank you so much for your time today and for sharing your knowledge and your insights with us.
Thank you.
This has been CPD on Demand.